Welcome to History 4314, American History Through Film. Today we're going to break the sound barrier. That is, we're going to enter into Hollywood's golden age that was inaugurated with the first sound film in 1927, The Jazz Singer. And we're going to look particularly at how Hollywood met the Great Depression. This was truly Hollywood's most innovative period, but we're going to look also at the underside of what happened. The movie that ushered in the talkies was The Jazz Singer, and it is one of the few Hollywood films to deal with the Jewish experience. It's the story of the conflict between an aged cantor, that is a Jewish ritual singer, and his young assimilated son who wanted to enter into show business. Al Jolson was the film's star, and he was almost literally playing himself in this film. His father was a Russian immigrant, a rabbi who abhorred his son's attraction to the secular world. The plot was very simple. Cantor Rabinowitz assumes that his only son will follow in his footsteps. 8 generations of rabbis and cantors is not to be broken. But young Jakey would rather sneak off to the local saloon to entertain. When his father catches him and forbids him from setting foot there again, the boy runs away. Years pass. Jakey changes his name. He becomes a nightclub singer. The film's dilemma is set when the father cannot sing on the holiest of Jewish holidays on Yom Kippur. The congregation asks Jakey, now Jack, to stand in, but Jakey's Broadway debut is scheduled to take place at the same time. Jakey's Broadway premiere is postponed while he sings in the synagogue, and then there's an epilogue to the film where Jakey sings Mammy while his mother beams approval. Now all this makes the film sound fairly pat, and yet we're going to take a look at this film, which plays a really pivotal place in Hollywood's history, to see what it tells us. And before we go on to that, I'd like to show you the marquee outside one of the theaters where the film played. If we could have the overhead projector, it's a little bit offensive, because you'll notice that Al Jolson plays this role in blackface. And this is one of many films of the 20s and 30s performed in blackface. And one of the things we're going to talk about at the beginning of our class today is what this means, why this happens. The original intention of The Jazz Singer was to be a silent movie with songs. And this innovation was not nearly as new as people later in time would assume. Thomas Edison experimented with sound and film at the turn of the century. After all, he had invented the phonograph, and it seemed like a rather simple idea to synchronize phonograph records with films. Shorts featuring singers had been shown as a part of movie programs during the 1920s. What made The Jazz Singer different was speech, and that was a result of a mistake, because Sam Warner of Warner Brothers had ordered a ban on dialogue in the film. Al Jolson would speak for around 15 seconds, but 5 words were the ones that counted. You ain't heard nothing yet. Now, we're going to try to show you a clip from The Jazz Singer where you'll see him say the first words. Let's see if we can make this work.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you. You ain't heard nothing. You want to hear Toot Toot Tootsie? All right, hold on. Lou, listen. Play Toot Toot Tootsie. 3/4, you understand?
Okay, that's enough of the clip. You get a sense of who Al Jolson was. And believe it or not, those lines ignited the public. Warner Brothers stock shot up from $9 a share to $132 a share the next day after the release of The Jazz Singer. 5 words made all the difference. But what we're going to do next is talk about the larger meaning of The Jazz Singer. And to do this, we're going to talk about Hollywood and race. Hollywood's founding motion picture, the film that put Hollywood on the map, was Birth of a Nation in 1915, the 100th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. It was the longest, costliest, most ambitious, most spectacular film to date. Its technique, its expense, its length, its mass audience, its critical reception, all these made it the most important American film of the silent era. And of course, Birth of a Nation is a celebration of the Ku Klux Klan. The Jazz Singer, 1927, marked the beginning of the sound era. It was the first movie to have speech. It was also the first movie to integrate musical numbers into its plot, as you saw. It broke all existing box office records, and its sequel, the 1928 film Singing Fool, was the leading moneymaker of the entire 1920s. But of course, The Jazz Singer starred an actor who plays his role in blackface. Gone with the Wind in 1939 was Hollywood's all-time biggest box office success. And if you control for inflation, it remains the all-time most watched film in Hollywood history. It, of course, represents a defense of the moonlight and magnolia image of the Old South. It's a nostalgic look at the world that produced slavery. So the 3 movies that provide the framework for American film history, that provide the scaffolding around which Hollywood history was made, all 3 movies deal with race, and more than that, they deal with race in ways that we find extremely upsetting and extremely offensive. In Birth of a Nation, white men dressed in sheets attack African Americans who supposedly threaten the honor of white women. Birth of a Nation provides an extreme Southern view, white Southern view of Reconstruction, and justifies political and social repression. In The Jazz Singer, Al Jolson sings in blackface. It's a story of assimilation. It's a story of Americanization, but it is also tarred by an offensive racial image. Indeed, I should note that the character of Mickey Mouse was actually modeled on Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer, and so this black-faced image persists even into our own time in the 21st century. So it's not all gone. Gone with the Wind, of course, embodies the South's plantation myth, the idea that the South represented a higher set of ideals, a higher set of values than those of the grasping, materialistic north. But of course, among those values was the value of racial hierarchy and indeed of slavery. So far in our class, I've argued to you that one of Hollywood's major goals, one of Hollywood's major successes, was to forge a common American identity. Hollywood forged an identity that transcended geography, that transcended ethnicity, that transcended social class. It created what we mean by an American identity. But what I want to do next is to begin to complicate that point. Much of modern American culture was appropriated from African Americans. The most popular mass entertainment in the 19th century was minstrel songs. You've all heard them by Stephen Foster and the like. This was the most important part of American culture. And these songs like Oh, Susanna, and Old Folks at Home, and I Dream of Jeannie were clearly modeled on African American songs. Then, ragtime, jazz, blues, and of course, rock and roll were also appropriated from African American musical traditions. Irving Berlin's Alexander's Ragtime Band, of course, had African American roots, as did George Gershwin's popular song, Swanee. And as you all know, in more recent times, Elvis Presley found inspiration in black music and performance styles. So long after blackface had disappeared, clearly the African American influence on popular culture remained intact. And of course, it's still true even today. But what I want to argue with you next is where racism fits into all this. At the same time that white America appropriated African American culture and helped turn it into American mass culture, racism also existed and obscured that African American contribution. Let me try to explain what I mean by all this. James Baldwin, the great writer, once wrote, "No one was white before he or she came to America. Everyone who got here and paid the price of the ticket, the price was to become white." What does he mean by that? I think he means two very different things, two sort of paradoxes. On the one hand, white Americans were often attracted to blackness, or at least to what blackness represented psychologically and culturally, even at the same time that many whites embraced racism and rejected blackness. Now, let me try to explain all this and see if I can persuade you of this argument. It's striking to me, if you look at fashion models or Hollywood actresses, some of the things that they do to their bodies. And it looks like they fit a sort of pattern, if you think about it. They tan their bodies, they perm their hair, they undergo collagen injections in their lips. In other words, in some ways, they're trying to look more African American. We can see a very different version of this if you look at suburban youth and the way suburban youth devour rap music and worship Michael Jordan. At the very time that people live apart from African Americans, they're embracing African American culture. This is certainly paradoxical, but I think it has a real history to it, a history that we can explore a bit. A conscious or not so conscious racism has also often combined in America with a view of African American culture as more dynamic, less repressed, more style conscious, more emotionally intense, more expressive than European culture. So you have this sort of odd mixture of attitudes. Hollywood films like Birth of a Nation, The Jazz Singer, and Gone with the Wind romanticized the Old South. They reinforced racial stereotypes. They intensified racial divisions. That is, they made whites, regardless of their ethnicity, feel white, that is, different from blackness. And so racist films could serve as symbols of belonging and assimilation. Okay. Yet many American Jews also identified with African Americans as a persecuted, dispersed people, and many Jewish artists and filmmakers would see in African American culture a vitality and a variety that they found highly attractive. Now, ads for The Jazz Singer showcased Al Jolson in blackface. Remember that picture that I showed earlier? If we could have the overhead projector again. I mean, this was widely used to advertise the film. And it's not exactly clear what we should make of this. We find it incredibly derogatory. But as I'm trying to suggest, there's a couple of sides to this incredibly derogatory use of imagery. American Jews in the early 20th century sought to revitalize American culture, often with white versions of African American folk productions. If you've ever seen the movie Showboat or the play Showboat, or you've seen Porgy and Bess, then you know what I'm getting at. This tapping the roots of African American culture and creating new mass cultural materials from this. The guardians of American culture had feared silent film as an immigrant menace to the dominant genteel culture. If you went to a Nickelodeon, if you went to a silent movie theater, you would watch again and again comic violence directed against authority figures. Clearly did not like the custodians of culture. Silent movies, as I've explained in our class, dealt with class struggle, labor conflict, political corruption, and social problems like divorce, drugs, prostitution, and venereal disease. But the Jewish moguls wanted film to become a middle-class form of entertainment. They didn't want it to simply appeal to the working class. Adolf Zucker said they wanted to kill the slum tradition in the movies. They wanted movie palaces, not Nickelodeons. They wanted to turn movies into vehicles of Americanization. And so while the custodians of culture disliked the filmmakers, in fact, the filmmakers shared some of the same ideas. They were trying to Americanize viewers. By the 1920s, the movie palace with its lush decor was intended to attract the middle class and uplift and refine the working class and immigrants. And what movies would do, I'll argue to you, is they screen out certain things and they help educate people in certain ways. This is what I mean by film's ideological function. Okay. Films of the 1920s will largely screen out politics. They will screen out immigrant life for the most part. Instead, what films will do is to focus on glamour and the attractions of modern life. And no film underscores this better than The Jazz Singer. Okay. It is almost a perfect symbol for what Hollywood is trying to do. The desire to be a jazz singer, and jazz, of course, has African-American roots, leads young Jakey Rabinowitz into a conflict with his father. So the son changes his name, remember, and he's thrown out of his house. Then, when the son's about to open on Broadway, he learns his father is dying. Torn between Broadway and the synagogue, he abandons the show temporarily. He replaces his father for the Yom Kippur service and chants the Kol Nidre, the chant of the Day of Atonement, as his father dies. And then, as I said before, in the movie's final scene, he's on the Broadway stage singing Mammy in blackface while his non-Jewish girlfriend and his Jewish mother smile. And this was very much the message that the Hollywood moguls wanted to get across. Al Jolson chooses modern American entertainment over old world religious ritual. That's the theme of The Jazz Singer. So The Jazz Singer is a tale of intergenerational conflict. It's a tale of Jewish assimilation, and it's perfect for the Hollywood moguls. When Al Jolson sings the Irving Berlin song, Blue Skies, I guess you'll be able to see Willie Nelson sing the same song at the rodeo. The father enters the house that's being profaned with jazz and shouts, "Stop!" But the question I think we still need to figure out is, what does blackface have to do with any of this? Why must Al Jolson sing in blackface, what we find so terribly offensive? In the film, blackface represents a release from white inhibitions. It also symbolizes jazz. Jazz comes from a word in the African American community that had meant copulation at the time. In choosing The Jazz Singer as the first talking picture, Hollywood's former peddlers and junk dealers and Nickelodeon operators created a kind of collective autobiography. They told their story. They did this very rarely, but they did it this once. The movie was premiered the night before Yom Kippur in 1927, and ironically, the day before Sam Warner died of a tooth abscess, of all things, at the age of 39, and so the Warner brothers themselves were not in attendance at the movie's premiere. The movie promised that the son could have it all. He could have a Jewish past, and an American future. He could have a Jewish mother, and he could have a non-Jewish wife. In other words, he could be assimilated, yet hold on to tradition too. And is, of course, isn't that the wonderful Hollywood message that you can always have it all? Now, all the problems in the film, of course, involve the conflict between father and son. There is no anti-Semitism in The Jazz Singer. That might have offended the mass audience. It's the father that keeps young Jakey from assimilating, right? It's not anything in American culture that keeps him from assimilating. And indeed, in almost all of Hollywood's ethnic films, and that includes up to the present, you hardly ever encounter real prejudice. Instead, Hollywood films almost always substitute intergenerational conflict, father and son, mother and daughter, over intermarriage as a source of conflict, over prejudice as a source of conflict. What I'm trying to suggest to you is that Hollywood develops formulas that are specially designed not to offend the mass audience, that send very reassuring messages. And so if you look at ethnic films even today, you'll see this pattern: to avoid prejudice and instead suggest that the conflicts are within families. So what I'm trying to argue to you is that films like The Jazz Singer screen out social reality. They are ideological. That is, they're sending messages about how societies function, but they're biased messages. They leave out certain elements, and the elements they leave out aren't accidents, because they would offend people. So you wouldn't know that in 1927 there were deep, bitter conflicts between old stock Americans and immigrants. You wouldn't know that in 1927 there were deep, bitter battles between the anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, racist Ku Klux Klan and urban ethnics. That is what's missing from the movies. The movies look as if they're accurate portrayals of reality. Everything about a movie is designed to make it look real. And yet, systematically, certain realities are excluded. Jews made up 21% of immigration in 1920. And when the new immigration law was passed in 1924, Jews made up 0%. In 1927, when The Jazz Singer came out, Jews made up 0% of immigrants to the United States. During the 1920s, Harvard prohibited African Americans from its dorms and instituted admissions quotas for Jews. Now, none of those kind of themes make their way into the movies. Now, you'll say no one would ever want to see that, but that's just the point about how ideologies function. Henry Ford in 1927 was raving about Jewish supremacy in the motion picture world and claimed that the Jewish Jazz Trust makes you sing, and he distributed a vicious anti-Semitic tract called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. An author named Lathrop Stoddard produced a popular book called The Rising Tide of Color Against White Supremacy. It was a bestseller in the mid-1920s. It discussed the desperate attempt of the Jew to pass himself off as white. I mean, this is the context in which a movie like The Jazz Singer is made. This is what you don't see. The Jazz Singer represented a way to attack anti-Semitism by arguing the Jews wanted to transcend and escape Judaism, and they wanted to become modern Americans. Resistance to a Jew becoming an American does not come from the Ku Klux Klan, does not come from Lathrop Stoddard, it does not come from Henry Ford in the movies. It comes from a Jewish father, not from non-Jews. So the Jazz Singer, I think, sends all kinds of interesting messages that are very much products of the people who made it. They want Jews to be socially accepted, and the only vehicle they see for doing that is to argue that Jews want to transcend Judaism. So the Jazz Singer is a plea for acceptance based on the idea that Jews are really no different than other Americans. And as we look later in our course at Hollywood's treatment of race and ethnicity, I think you'll see this formula used again and again and again. It's a formula that works. Now let's take this one step further. It's no accident that a Jewish immigrant who had never seen a baseball game wrote "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." And it's no accident that Irving Berlin wrote "White Christmas" and "Easter Parade" and "God Bless America," songs that celebrate Christian holidays and nationality, but notice in a non-sectarian way. The White Christmas that Irving Berlin sings about is not really a religious holiday. It's a family event. It's non-sectarian. Easter Parade is more about showing off hats than it is about anything to do with religion. And God Bless America is not about a Christian God or any kind of religious God, clearly. It's something quite different. It's a non-sectarian deity. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that during the 1920s, Hollywood is beginning to pioneer formulas that it will continue to use even till this day. If you're going to talk about women, for example, one way that Hollywood will often do this is with the Cinderella formula. Poor girl meets rich guy, and they fall in love and eventually marry after overcoming many obstacles. Young people want to be accepted, they want to be assimilated. It's their family that holds them back. So what Hollywood is experimenting with is that formulas that will speak to people's deep psychological needs but not offend the mass audience. Okay. So it's very creative, I think, in its own way. Later in our class, for example, we'll see the formulas that Hollywood developed to make the Vietnam War acceptable to Americans. No one in the 1960s wanted to see movies about the Vietnam War, but Hollywood found ways to make people see the war. Stories of assimilation like The Jazz Singer, where Jews become wholly assimilated, these would become important formulas. Jewish sacred music is replaced by American jazz. Now, in the early 20th century, the actual intermarriage rate between Jews and non-Jews was basically non-existent. It was less than 1%. But the fantasy that Hollywood puts forward in The Jazz Singer is the fantasy of intermarriage. So The Jazz Singer is not a movie about modern multiculturalism. It is not a PC movie, and not just because of its use of blackface. The Jazz Singer is very much a celebration of the older idea of the melting pot, where all ethnic identities disappear and are melded into something new. And this, I think, reflected the attitudes of the people who made the movie. In the 1940s, 80% of those who applied for name changes in the United States were Jewish, just like Jakey Rabinowitz in The Jazz Singer. Now, it's easy to poke fun at what the Hollywood moguls did in making The Jazz Singer. And it's easy to condemn them for their unwillingness to even defend their own identity. And yet we have to remember that they're doing this against a backdrop of deep anti-Semitism in the United States. During World War II, almost half of all Americans said they sympathized with anti-Semitic attitudes. Only 30% of Americans opposed anti-Semitism. Yet by 1950, thanks to Hitler in his own perverted way, only 10% of Americans objected to Jewish neighbors, and 69% said it would make no difference at all. But assimilation, often in American history, has come at the expense of African Americans. So I want to look a little bit deeper at the topic of race. Jewish entertainers dominated early 20th century comedy, and mid-century comedy for that matter. George Burns, who only recently died, Eddie Cantor, George Jessel, Fanny Brice, Sophie Tucker, these were the major American comedians of the early 20th century, all got their start in blackface. Blackface, on the one hand, hid these performers' Jewish identity. Many would change their name, like Jack Benny. Ironically, blackface made them seem more American. This is sure odd, right? The black-inspired comedy and music and performance styles of urban Jews were a way to challenge Protestant genteel culture, a culture based on ideas of timeless truth and proper standards of decency. In 1900, all the citadels of culture in the United States were controlled by elite Protestants. Every university, every publishing house, every major magazine. And what would happen after 1900 is that monopoly over the citadels of authority would be broken. Outsiders, first Jews, then many other groups, would begin to challenge this dominance of American culture. Now, the genteel tradition, you'll need to know this, believed in the reality and certainty of moral values. It believed that the function of art and literature was to transmit Protestant Anglo-Saxon ideals. As one exponent of the genteel tradition put it, a novelist should use no phrase that would make his wife or daughter blush. But by the 1920s, the custodians of genteel culture were under siege, especially from Jewish writers and Jewish filmmakers. What Jewish urban entertainers did is they created an alternative world, a much more multicultural world, with its own distinctive expressive forms deeply indebted to African American culture. So Jews would receive acceptance largely through their participation in mass entertainment and helped play a pivotal role in bringing African American culture to the attention of white Americans. So just to give you an example, jazz would enter American popular culture with a Jewish face. Whites did not listen to the great creators of jazz, to Jelly Roll Morton, or to King Oliver, or Louis Armstrong, or Duke Ellington, or Fletcher Henderson until much, much later in time. It was through figures like Irving Berlin, George Gershwin, Al Jolson, Sophie Tucker, later Benny Goodman. That's how white America was introduced to jazz. Songs like Waiting for the Robert E. Lee, notice the Southern reference, The Red, Red Robin Comes Bobbin' Along, Rockabye My Baby with a Dixie Melody. These songs by Jewish composers introduced white America to jazz. We often underplay how important racism was in American culture at the past. At the same time that Al Jolson was the most popular box office star in Hollywood, wearing blackface, Amos and Andy was the most popular show on radio. Americans accepted black culture, but only when it was accompanied by a white face or a white face wearing blackface. Very odd and very peculiar. So let's now turn to the arrival of sound and the way that sound transformed the movies. By the end of 1929, just 2 years after The Jazz Singer, 8,700 movie theaters out of 20,000 were wired for sound. Sound changed everything. Screen comedy became verbal, not visual, as it had been under the slapstick comedies of Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin. The need for dialogue brought in new actors and actresses. What worked best, it turned out, were people with unusual voices. It's not so much that many of the silent stars didn't have good voices. They had perfectly adequate voices, but they weren't distinctive voices. And it's distinctive voices that work so well in the movies. New writers from literature, theater, newspapers were hired. And so with the phenomenal success of The Jazz Singer, Hollywood quickly made a transition from the silence to the talkies. You can see that story told in the movie Singing in the Rain, which is, of course, about this transition. Let me mention one other thing, just briefly, and that has to do with color. They could have introduced color at the same time they introduced sound. Injecting color into the movies turned out to be much harder to sell to people than injecting sound into the movies. And this is very peculiar, and I'd be curious if you have some thoughts about why this would be. Today, it's hard to get people to watch black and white movies. It's so hard that Ted Turner goes around colorizing black and white movies to get people to watch them. But it took the founder of a corporation called Technicolo more than 2 decades to convince movie makers about the viability of color. It only took 2 years for sound to transform the movies, but it took 2 decades for color to do the same thing. The entrepreneur behind color was named Herbert T. Kalmus. His first system required 2 projectors running simultaneously, And you can only imagine how hard it was to get the timing just right. But the real problem was that the stars themselves did not want to be shown in color. Why do you think? Press here.
Black and white's a whole lot more appealing, I guess.
But we don't think that way, do we? I mean, I'm just curious. I mean,
black and white pictures are always, they're more appealing to me. I don't know about you.
No, I think clearly that's how the stars felt. I mean, it took a long time to convince them that they would look better in color. To me, it's very interesting. It's not sort of what you'd expect. In 1922, Kalmus had developed a two-color process that used a single projector. He cemented two dyed strips of film together. And then later in 1932, Walt Disney will use a three-color, three-strip process that allows you to have real color pictures, the modern Technicolor process. So the technology is there to do this. It's just that people aren't all that interested in it. Douglas Fairbanks is, remember Douglas Fairbanks from last class, he made a film called The Black Pirate using the Technicolor process in the mid-1920s. It could be done. He made one color movie and he never made another. It's very interesting. The technology was there and it was not embraced by the public. So let's talk more about how sound changed the movies. Movies would undergo a dramatic transformation between 1927 and 1930. The movies were really totally transformed. It's not just sound. Sound symbolizes much broader changes. First of all, movies shed their Victorian trappings. D.W. Griffith and Charlie Chaplin had been so influential that they had shaped the way movies were made. Movies were Victorian, that is, they were sentimental. They tended to use a lot of melodrama, that's exaggerated emotions. They used an acting style that very much emphasized pantomime. We find it rather unappealing. And in just 3 years, Hollywood abandoned that older approach and adopted a newer approach. First and most obviously, sound revolutionized screen acting. Instead of a style that emphasizes the grandiose, broad motions, you have a style that's much more intimate, much more vernacular or common or ordinary, much more specific. The first words, remember, that Al Jolson uses are, "You ain't heard nothing yet," the most famous ad lib in film history. And that slangy wisecrack embodied the new tone of the movies. That the movies were not supposed to be Victorian novels made on the screen. People would talk in ordinary slang just as they do in real life. Further, movies became more American. Movies became more American. Who knew that Charlie Chaplin was British? Can't tell. There's no sound. But suddenly, Hollywood emphasizes American characters. Movies would speak with local accents and local inflections. Jimmy Cagney's New Yorkese, Gary Cooper's Western drawl, Katharine Hepburn's high-toned Connecticut speech. As I said earlier, they wanted distinctive speaking styles, and in getting those, they made movies seem more American. Okay, second, sound encouraged the flourishing of genres that silence had hindered. The musical the gangster film, the detective story, screwball comedy, humor that depends on language rather than slapstick. All those genres had never flourished in the silent era. And now suddenly they become Hollywood's bread and butter. And in certain ways that remains true even today. Third, sound encouraged economic concentration within the movie industry. RCA and Western Electric monopolized sound technology. The added expense of producing talkies encouraged economic concentration. And so while there were a variety of studios on the West Coast, all of them were under the control of Morgan or Rockefeller financial interests by the mid-1930s. So what difference does that concentration make? What difference does it make when large financial interests control the movies? The answer, I think, is simple. The large-scale financial interests wanted to make sure that movies were box office successes. And the way to ensure that was to produce formula films. Movies that you could be pretty sure were going to be successful. We're going to make Star Wars, only we're going to put it on Mars. I mean, you take a formula and then you make a slight variant of it. So what Hollywood would do is to produce endless reworkings of a few basic genres, producing them again and again and again. Further, this growing concentration economically intensified the commerciality of American films. The films will rework certain basic myths and certain basic ideologies of American culture, something that I'll explain later. The movies would assert a faith in individualism, a faith that you can solve all your problems yourself, a faith that all problems in American society are transient and will eventually simply disappear. So it is in this crucial period that the classic Hollywood film is created. And when I use the phrase the classic Hollywood film, I don't simply mean to refer to great films. I mean films of a particular kind that have certain characteristics that you're going to need to know for our exam. But let me talk a bit about this period in which the classic Hollywood film comes to dominate not only in the United States, but in the entire world. In a period of 16 years, for that period, an average of 80 million Americans would go to the movies every week. Just incredible. The movies would attract 83 cents of every dollar Americans would spend on entertainment. Think of the dominance of one industry over entertainment. Hollywood would produce an astonishing number of films, an average of 476 every year for 16 years. These days, Hollywood produces well less than 100 films a year. And Hollywood would define what we mean by a movie. Certainly other people would create other kinds of films, but when we think of what a film is, we mean a Hollywood film. Hollywood would set the terms by which all movies would be evaluated. Another characteristic of classic Hollywood film is that it was, in some sense, truly international, in a way movies aren't these days. Hollywood would eagerly exploit any available talent. Hollywood would lure international movies' most important figures to Hollywood. If you were good, they would capture you just like a spider with a web. Actors and actresses like Greta Garbo, Hedy Lamarr, Marlene Dietrich, directors like Sergei Eisenstein, Jean Renoir, Fritz Lang, character actors, cameramen, lighting technicians. Hollywood would intentionally attract the best there were, at least in the Western world. The fact that the studio moguls had been born in Europe made a big difference. They were able to suck all these people to Hollywood. Let me give you the example of Casablanca, the classic American film. Well, Humphrey Bogart was American, and Dooley Wilson was American, and the scriptwriter, Howard Koch, who will later be blacklisted, also was American. And that was it. Everyone else who worked on the movie was not American. A Hungarian directed the film. The cast included a Swede, an Austrian, 2 Englishmen, a German, two Hungarians, a Norwegian, a Russian, and a Frenchman, and the score was composed by an Austrian. And this would be true of many Hollywood films. The score to High Noon, the classic Western score written by a Russian. Hollywood was truly international in a way that it is not now. It was, even though there are people like Gerard Depardieu who arrive in Hollywood. During this classic period, one reason that Hollywood is globally dominant is because it bought up all the best people everywhere and brought them to Hollywood and had them make movies there. It truly was Western cinema. So what are the characteristics of classic Hollywood films that you are going to need to know? Number 1. The subordination of film technique to the interests of the film's narrative. What do I mean by that? When you watch a Hollywood film, you are not supposed to notice the style that it was filmed in. You are supposed to focus on the story itself. Okay? Everything about the film is supposed to make it look real. Camera placement, lighting, focus, casting, framing, editing, everything is designed so that when you look at the screen, you feel that you are part of the set. That they're looking at you as if you were just there, a fly on the wall. In short, one characteristic of classic Hollywood film is that the style is what I would call transparent. It is inconspicuous. Now that's actually very hard to do. It is not easy. If you've ever taken home movies, you know how easy it is to make the style central. To make things really look natural costs a lot of money, requires a lot of work, but that is a defining characteristic of Hollywood film. Lighting remains unobtrusive. Camera angles are generally at eye level. The framing is always designed so that the action takes place at the center of the screen, making it easy to trim films for television, right? Cuts occur at logical points in the action and logical points in the dialogue. That's why it's so easy to cut Hollywood films and put in commercials. So lighting, focus, camera angle, framing, character blocking, set design, costuming, camera distance, all are designed to keep the object of interest in the center of your attention, the center of the frame. So films were designed to create the illusion of realism because what they're intended to do is to make you identify with the hero and less often with the heroine. Okay, this is done quite intentionally. Characteristic number 2. Convert all political, sociological, and economic dilemmas into personal melodramas. If you want to send a message, call Western Union. Tell a story about people, Hollywood recommends. So, in Casablanca, the classic World War II movie, it's about American anxiety about intervention in the war. It comes out in early 1942. America's just gotten involved in the war. But that's not what the movie tells you. It tells you the story of Rick Blaine and his hesitance to help Victor Laszlo, who's active in the anti-Nazi underground. You turn a political story into a human story. That's characteristic number 2. Melodrama is a broad term stressing strong emotion, high adventure, frequent suffering, or self-sacrifice in service to some noble cause or some difficult passage of life. In other words, you recast an abstract issue into something dramatic and highly personal. If you want to write $1 million script in Hollywood, you learn how to transform abstractions into human stories. Each character, in turn, is defined by his or her moral or social commitments. People aren't complex in Hollywood movies, right? They have to work through a kind of visual shorthand. The term melodrama originated in the Victorian theater, where drama was accompanied by orchestral music to intensify the feelings appropriate to each scene. Melodrama is expected to provide audiences with vicarious emotional experience. Our lives are uneventful. Melodrama makes them seem more eventful. Melodramas provide us with an opportunity to fantasize, to take ourselves out of our ordinary existence and imagine that we're somebody else. So, and further, movies and melodramas allow us to enact real but repressed inner conflicts and inner turmoil. Now, the messages that melodramas typically present us with, the morals that they typically offer us, are usually pretty simple. That is, virtue will triumph over evil. Love can defeat all obstacles. Courage has great rewards. Suffering ennobles the spirit, the indomitable spirit of the ordinary human being. Isn't that the theme of Rocky that you've all seen? The messages of Hollywood melodramas are usually pretty banal when looked at closely. Characteristic number 3. Characteristic number 3. The cult of the outlaw hero. The cult of the outlaw hero. What do I mean by that? The prototypical hero in a Hollywood film is a loner. The classic hero is a wanderer or an adventurer. And a natural man, and I'm using man intentionally, uncomfortable with restraints. A hero ambivalent about law. A hero ambivalent about politics. A hero free of all entanglements. And if you look at most films today, I think you will see that the cult of the outlaw hero has not declined one bit. It's during the early 1930s that Hollywood figured out that this is the character that audiences want to see. This is the character that they identify with. And so film after film after film emphasizes this figure. Now, what's interesting about the outlaw hero is he's not simple. He's a peculiar mixture of opposites. So in classic Hollywood films, you often see that the boxer's also a musician. Doesn't make any sense in real life, but it happens all the time in film. The soldier is also a pacifist. Again, it seems contradictory. Hollywood has no trouble with that contradiction. Just see Sergeant York. An aristocrat is also a rebel. Again, it seems contradictory, but it's often the case in Hollywood films. Just take a look at the films in the theaters now. Now, the outlaw hero generally does not have classic good looks. He has an irregular handsomeness with weary, cynical eyes and an idiosyncratic mouth. If you're too handsome, you won't make it in Hollywood. You need to look distinctive and a little bitter and cynical. Otherwise, the audience finds it very hard to identify with you. Characteristic number 4. The movies popularize a fast, invigorating, tantalizing alternative to the genteel culture. An alternative to the moralistic, nativistic, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant tradition. Under the genteel tradition, hierarchies are rigid, values are unchanging. The genteel culture valued self-control, sobriety, delayed gratification. That's not what Hollywood films will celebrate. The movies value laughter, excitement, liberation, and entertainment. The good life, that's what the movies introduce you to. Extravagance, abandon, revelry, instant gratification. These are the values popularized by the movies. And so, classic American film would create a powerful cluster of ideas and images that created a shared sense of the American dream. The classic Hollywood movies also disseminated a mythic portrait of America as an optimistic, classless, cooperative, essentially innocent and good society. Film after film conveys that message. Class conflict and rigid class lines have no place in this mythic America. In this mythic America, all hard choices can always be avoided because everything does work out right in the end. So Hollywood, during its golden age, would reach unprecedented audiences, and it would produce the greatest films in its history. But it also produced formulaic genre pictures and movies that emphasize entertainment rather than wrestling with serious moral or political issues. Now, in the last few minutes of our first half, I want to go over a subject that we touched on briefly in our preceding class, but one I think that you need to be thinking about, because this is the backdrop against which the movies are created. The basic conflict in American society in the 20th century has not been a conflict between the rich and poor. It has not been a conflict between the North and South, or between the East and West. And it was not a conflict between women and men. The basic conflict in American society in the 20th century, and one suspects in the 21st century, was a conflict in values. It was a conflict between two conflicting cultures. There was a traditionalist culture emphasizing patriarchal authority, racial hierarchy, traditional morality, and there was a modernist culture stressing consumption, leisure, and personal freedom. These two cultures represented two very different views of life, two very different moral orders. And it was in the 1920s that these two cultures first came to blows. The 1920s were a decade when an older America tangibly gave way to the future. A land of farms and villages became a country of factories and cities. The Protestant values of the 19th centuries were now challenged by Catholicism and Judaism, and especially from a new secular culture that the movies helped disseminate. So what I'm trying to suggest to you was that the 1920s marked a great civil war, a moral civil war, a cultural civil war. A war that pitted fundamentalists against religious liberals, pitted wets against dries, natives against immigrants. And what I think really propelled this was that African Americans, women, and immigrants were no longer willing to put up with restrictions on their lives. Religion, as we talked about in our last class, was one battlefield in this cultural civil war. A deep schism penetrated American Protestantism. Modernists were no longer willing to hold on to religious beliefs that conflicted with science. And a new group of people called evangelicals struggled to preserve the tenets of traditional faith. So evangelicals were protesting against the new cosmopolitan secular world. Evangelicals emphasized just those religious beliefs that modernists rejected: the importance of personal conversion, the infallibility of the Bible, and the reality of miracles described in the Bible. One group of evangelicals, called Pentecostalists, rejected the idea that the age of miracles had passed. They believed that God was constantly performing miracles. The most successful of all those Pentecostal ministers was a woman named Amy Semple McPherson, M-C-P-H-E-R-S-O-N, and you can see her in the movies. She was played by Bette Davis and by Faye Dunaway. She was a faith healer, an evangelist, and she would become a star. She was the most colorful and exciting evangelist in American history. She popularized Pentecostalism. But what's interesting to me is she also adopted Hollywood techniques in order to promote what she was doing. She combined faith with theatrics. She wore flowing white gowns, and the sick, the halt, the lame, the deaf would come to her and she would cure them in front of the entire audience. She started preaching in dingy halls, but later was preaching in sports arenas, was preaching in huge auditoriums, and eventually built a $1 million church in Los Angeles, which had 5,000 seats in it. She would pass the collection plate around and she would say she didn't like the tinkle of silver. She liked the rustle of dollar bills. But scandal would strike her like many later evangelical ministers, unfortunately. She was supposedly kidnapped. Newspapers claimed it was a love tryst. Eventually she arrived back and they tried to sue her, prosecute her, but she survived this and larger crowds came to see her in the future. Okay, let's stop there.